Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're embarking on a deep dive into Henry Louis Mencken's rather notorious work, Notes on Democracy, originally published way back in 1926. Our mission here is, well, to try and unravel Mencken's incredibly sharp, often scathing observations on what he saw as the true nature of democracy and the democratic man. It's a look at a surprisingly candid perspective from nearly a century ago that, maybe for better or worse, still sparks some uncomfortable recognition today.
Oh, it really does. Mencken, as you'll quickly find out, he pulls no punches whatsoever. He wasn't really interested in, romanticizing democracy or the average citizen. Not at all. Instead, he painted this picture of the common person driven less by these lofty ideals of liberty and intellectual rigor and more by pretty fundamental human impulses. Fear, envy, and just a basic desire for comfort over everything else.
So in his view, democracy itself becomes like a kind of stage, a place where politicians, as he famously put it, hoodwink and swindle the easily swayed masses.
Exactly. He saw it as a system just inherently prone to manipulation, playing directly on people's fears and, well, their self-interest.
Here's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Hmm.
He argued that democracy, especially in America, was deeply, almost organically tied to Puritanism.
Yeah, that's a really crucial link he makes. He saw both as stemming from what he called the inferior man's fear and hatred of his betters, and driven by this pervasive sense of envy.
Okay, so from that perspective, corruption wasn't some kind of flaw in the democratic system. It was baked in. A feature.
Pretty much, yeah, it was a feature. He contended that the populace itself was, in a sense, corrupt. They viewed government as nothing more than a tool for their own exploitation, so, well, why wouldn't politicians follow suit?
Right. And the consequence of this for Mencken was this tragic decline in the quality of public service. He believed democracy actively pushed away intelligent, self-respecting individuals.
Yeah, it repelled them, leaving the field open for, mediocrity and charlatanry.
So in the absence of a true aristocracy, what did he see emerging as the new ruling class?
For Mencken, it was a timid, self-serving plutocracy, basically, ruled by the wealthy. And what's fascinating here is his claim that the mob understood this new elite because their goals were fundamentally similar: materialistic gain. It's not by accident, he observed, that even a, quote, mob religion like Christianity, as he rather provocatively described it, paves heaven with gold and precious stones. It ties spiritual reward directly to tangible wealth.
Okay, so let's really unpack this concept of Mencken's democratic man. How did he see this figure evolving, and what did he think their true motivations were based on Notes on Democracy?
Well, Mencken traced the idea of the democratic man back to the sort of ideal being, almost a noble savage figure like you might find in Rousseau. This ideal was, in his words, imbued with mystical merit and ineradicable rectitude, suggesting some inherent goodness in the common person.
But Mencken wasn't buying it.
Not for a second. He dismisses this as just a romantic illusion. For him, the common man's actual desires were far more concrete and highly materialistic. Things like simply more to eat, less work, higher wages, lower taxes. It wasn't about abstract ideals like justice or liberty.
That's a pretty stark contrast to the usual lofty rhetoric. And he really leans into this idea of mob mentality, doesn't he? He points to things like the French Revolution.
Oh, absolutely. He points out how the common people in Paris first executed their king, then turned on the very people who had led them, only to end up with another monarchy pretty quickly afterwards.
So his conclusion was?
He asserted that the common people never vote for anything, but always against something. Their primary driver, he argued, was simply fear. He gives this incredibly vivid description of American history itself as melodramatic pursuit of horrendous monsters, most of them imaginary. The Redcoats, Hessians, the bank, the Catholics, the rum demon, Bolshevism. Fear was the ultimate political tool, in his view.
And from this rather bleak view of the common person, Mencken draws an even more controversial conclusion, talking about what he called the incurable infantilism of the inferior man.
Yeah, that's a really harsh phrase. He claimed that complex ideas just left them unscathed, meaning they couldn't really grasp them intellectually. Instead, they were responsive only to emotions. And he used that provocative analogy, saying these emotions were of tabby cats rather than of men, suggesting they were easily swayed, superficial, not based on deep thought.
Wow, that's quite a take on public intelligence. And he even broke it down further, didn't he, between the sort of rural farmer type and the city dweller.
He did. He distinguished between the virtuous clodhopper, that's his term for the farmer, or the rural yokel, and the city proletarian.
Hmm.
The clodhopper, he argued, saw government purely as a tool for promoting his private advantage and genuinely believed God regards him fondly. He characterized this rural type as prone to these frantic hatreds and envy against anyone seen as having a better time. He even cited the Mann Act as an example of legislation born from that kind of rural, moralistic envy.
And the city proletarian.
Well, Mencken saw them as still susceptible to envy, but maybe more distracted. Less prone to those intense, sustained hatreds because of all the urban diversions shows, tabloids, that kind of thing.
Okay, this leads us to perhaps one of his most challenging arguments. That the lower orders, as he put it, don't actually want liberty. That just flies in the face of everything we think about democracy.
It really does. He asserted that what they truly craved was, quote, ham and cabbage, just basic comfort and security. And, he contended, their very first act upon gaining power would be to destroy every form of freedom that didn't directly serve that basic comfort. He even said they'd end up butchering all professional libertarians.
That's a pretty chilling thought.
It is. Mencken famously wrote, "The great masses of men, though theoretically free, are seen to submit supinely to oppression and exploitation." For him, true liberty wasn't for everyone. It was the exclusive possession of a small and disreputable minority.
And then he goes even further, right? With this idea that the masses actually oppose progress, even when it benefits them.
Yeah, that's maybe the most surprising assertion. That the whole progress of the world, even in the direction of ameliorating the lot of the masses, is always opposed by the masses.
How did he back that up? Can you give some examples he used?
Sure. He pointed to things like the widespread opposition to smallpox vaccination, both in America and Switzerland, or how Bismarck's groundbreaking working men's legislation in Germany, which was actually designed to help workers, was fiercely fought by those workers.
Huh.
Yeah, and he even quoted Sir Henry Maine, who observed that universal suffrage would certainly have prohibited the spinning jenny and the power loom. The implication being that progress, especially technological progress, would just be stopped if you put it to a popular vote.
So Mencken's point was
What?
that people just don't like complex things.
Essentially, yeah. That the common man is fundamentally against exact knowledge because it's complex and it burdens his meager capacity. He prefers shortcuts, simple formulae, revelation. Mencken argued this explained the popularity of things like chiropractic back then, looking for easy answers.
Okay, so if that's the democratic man, what about the system they live in, the democratic state? He says this common man, the lowly Christian, as he calls him, is both the glory and the boss of democratic states. That sovereignty always resides with the mob.
Right, actually resides with the mob. Yet he immediately says this sovereignty is constantly limited. It's constrained by self-imposed constitutional checks, sure, but even more by restraints which lie in the very nature of government.
And this is where the manipulation comes in.
Exactly. This is where his famous claim comes in, that this mob is constantly bamboozled and exploited by small minorities of their own number. He described victimizing the populace as practically a profession, a lucrative profession, an exact science, and a delicate and lofty art.
That's incredibly cynical about political leadership. And he didn't really see much difference between representative democracy and direct democracy, did he?
Not fundamentally, no. He believed that in both forms, the sovereign mob must employ agents. And these agents inevitably have their own interests and, crucially, their own ways to influence the electors.
Because the citizens can't grasp the issues.
Well, he spoke of their congenital inability to comprehend many of the problems or to consider them unbiased. He even used the example of New England town meetings, often held up as pure democracy.
Yeah.
Mencken argued they were typically led, even manipulated, by just a few men of unusual initiative and determination who are often little more than local demagogues.
Which brings us neatly to his absolutely scathing critique of public service himself. Mencken actually argued it was, quote, a psychic impossibility for a gentleman to hold office under the federal union.
It's an incredible statement. He basically envisioned the typical American politician as someone fundamentally compromised, a person who is lied and dissembled, and a man who is crawl. Someone willing to embrace any issue, however idiotic, just to get votes, and ready to sacrifice any principle, however sound.
And he didn't stop at elected officials, did he? He went after the judiciary, too.
Oh, yeah. In his view, the American judiciary sinks quite as low. He saw judges often chosen for purely political reasons, willing to just acquiesce in the destruction of fundamental constitutional rights first, Second, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendments. He even accused them of conniving at the invasion of the 14th and 15th.
And he compared that unfavorably to the English system.
Very unfavorably. He thought the English bench was immensely better, and he put that down to its underlying aristocratic tradition, which he felt valued integrity more.
Now, here's a curious detail. He highlights something pretty uniquely American. The rule that legislators have to live in the district they represent.
Right, the residency requirement. Mencken saw this not as a good thing, not as a safeguard for local representation, but as a mechanism that filled Congress and state legislatures with puerile local politicians, and his words, unconscionable jackasses.
He had specific examples, didn't he?
He did. He specifically pointed to the delegations from Tennessee and Mississippi who were pushing hard for the 18th Amendment prohibition. He saw this as a prime example of this localism leading to what he considered extremely evil influence on national policy. Just narrow local prejudices writ large.
So this all paints a picture. It reinforces his larger point, doesn't it? That the common man's deepest desire isn't really for power or glory, but for safety.
Exactly. Not for a will to power, but for the simplest and most ignominious sort of peace, the peace of a trustee in a well-managed penitentiary. That's his phrase. The idea is they're willing to sacrifice dignity, pride, liberty itself, just for security and basic comfort.
And this longing for comfort, he suggested, actually makes democracy inherently fearful of the free spirit, the independent thinker.
Yes. He argued that democracy stands in greater peril of the free spirit than any sort of despotism. Why? Because it actively seeks to break all such free spirits to the common harness, to reduce everyone down to being docile John Does.
So the only real liberty under democracy for Mencken
was the liberty of the have-nots to destroy the liberty of the haves. He saw it as a kind of zero-sum game, driven by envy.
Which brings us back to that connection he made between democracy and Puritanism. You said he saw them as different facets of the same gem.
Exactly. Both, he believed, sprang from that same root. The inferior man's fear and hatred of his betters, fueled primarily by envy. So all that Puritan legislation, things like prohibition or what he called comstockery, attempts to suppress anything deemed immoral or obscene, Mencken saw it as only superficially altruistic.
Its real aim was?
Its true aim, Mencken argued, was to punish the other fellow for having a better time and to bring the other fellow down to his own unhappy level. It was about leveling down, driven by resentment.
So this moral compulsion of the Democrat, tied to the Puritan impulse, turns lawmaking into something else entirely. He called it lawmaking by orgy. What did he mean by that?
He's suggesting laws often aren't about calm, rational justice, but more about emotional outbursts, about settling scores, about persecuting people or groups that society, the mob, deems unpopular. He claimed it resulted in psychopathological persecution and private revenge, often targeting men of unusual intelligence and enterprise simply because they stand out and are inevitably unpopular in such a system.
And he cited examples again.
Yes, things like the anti-syndicalist laws out in California targeting labor organizers or the anti-evolution laws popping up in Tennessee and Mississippi.
And he saw this playing out in the courts, too.
Definitely. He noted how ambitious district attorneys would often go after conspicuous figures. He mentions the famous trials of Harry Thaw or Fatty Arbuckle mainly to advance their own careers. And in the process, constitutional rights, fundamental things like trial by jury, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, double jeopardy often got trampled, especially for those considered unpopular by the mob.
So taking all this together, his conclusion was that democratic government is inherently corrupt. He used the phrase wholesale bribery.
Yes, wholesale bribery. He saw the whole system as constantly bargaining with what he called prehensile minorities, powerful, grasping interest groups like labor leaders, manufacturers, specific religious denominations like the Methodists, or farmers essentially trading favors and public resources to maintain its own security and power.
Even at the highest levels.
Absolutely. He believed politicians, right up to the president, entered office burdened with promises of private reward from the public store. He gave the example of President Wilson appointing William Jennings Bryan as Secretary of State, which he saw as a purely political payoff.
And this internal corruption, he thought, spilled over into foreign relations.
Yes, he contended this deeply ingrained system of cheats and humbugs inevitably colored how democratic states dealt with other nations. It made countries like the U.S. or England, which he provocatively called perfide Albion, meaning treacherous England, essentially dubious friends and tricky foes.
And why was this tolerated? Why did people put up with it?
Because, he suggested, democratic man is corrupt himself. He views government as something external, something antagonistic, something fundamentally there to be exploited if possible. So the corruption at the top just mirrors the attitude at the bottom.
Okay. So after this incredibly bleak, unsparing diagnosis, what did Mencken see as the future for democracy? Did he offer any hope, any solutions?
Not really solutions, no. He made it very clear he considered himself a pathologist of democracy, not a therapist. He wasn't trying to fix it. He was just dissecting what he saw as its inherent flaws. He particularly highlighted the democratic tendency to believe that the insoluble is somehow unfashionable, this belief that any problem, no matter how complex, can just be solved by taking a vote or passing a new law.
And he had this idea that democracy might actually destroy itself, that it contained its own seeds of destruction.
He did. He suggested democracy might be a self-limiting disease, that it contained suicidal paradoxes. For instance, while it theoretically allows the ordinary person, his dough, a chance to rise and use their superiority, making everyone equal actually diminishes some of the rewards of rising. And yet, despite democracy's supposed hatred of class distinctions, it's always inventing new ones, creating new hierarchies with titles like Grand Goblin or Supreme Worthy Archon.
Because people need hierarchy.
That seems to be his implication, that the democratic man seems to need to belong to some kind of group with leaders, even if the titles are, well, a bit ridiculous.
And as we touched on earlier, in this democratic state without a real aristocracy, Mencken argued that plutocracy ruled by the wealthy just naturally fills the vacuum.
Right. And crucially, he believed the mob understood plutocracy. Why? Because its aspirations are essentially those of inferior men. That's where he brings in the Christianity example again. It is not by accident that Christianity, a mob religion, paves heaven with gold and precious stones, i.e. with money. It's a system, he suggests, that prioritizes visible materialistic achievement, which is easily grasped and even admired by the common person.
So ultimately, what does democracy give the common person, according to Mencken?
Well, he observed that this dominant political system provides the mob man with a crucial, comforting illusion. The illusion that he's really important to the world, that he's genuinely running things. This, he suggested, leads to a sense of vast and mysterious power and a deep conviction that he is somehow wise, even if the reality is quite different.
And yet, what's truly striking, and maybe the ultimate Mencken paradox, is that he confessed to taking a personal delight in democracy, despite everything he'd written.
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? He found it incomparably idiotic, and hence incomparably amusing. He loved the show, and he finished Notes on Democracy with these stark paradoxes. The mob is competent to rule, but it must be rigorously policed itself. And the highest function of the citizen is to serve the state, but the first assumption that meets him is an assumption of his disingenuousness and dishonor. Yeah. It's just full of these contradictions.
It really is. Mencken's 1926 critique, though, as you said, undeniably harsh, maybe even partisan in its own way. It does raise these profoundly uncomfortable questions about human nature, about political systems that still, well, they still hit a nerve today, don't they?
They absolutely do. He wasn't just observing his own time. He was perhaps highlighting things about democracy and human behavior that he saw as pretty unchanging.
So here's a final thought to leave our listeners with. If, as Mencken suggests, maybe even tongue-in-cheek, rascality is necessary to human government and even to civilization itself, that civilization at bottom is nothing but a colossal swindle, what does that imply about our own understanding, our expectations of governance today? And maybe what might Mencken say is the true, enduring benefit of democracy? If it's not actually but its lofty ideals, is it just the entertainment value he enjoyed?
It definitely forces us to confront some uncomfortable possibilities, doesn't it? We really encourage you, the listener, to think about Mencken's claims. How do those stack up against contemporary politics, against your own experiences? Is Notes on Democracy offering a kind of cynical truth that maybe we prefer to ignore? Or is it just a particularly jaundiced view from a specific contrarian personality? What stands out most to you from his critique? Something to mull over.